No, we're going to talk about restoring things tonight. And who's restored something old into something that looked new? What'd you restore?
I mean, I'm restoring a house.
You did it?
I mean, I didn't part.
She's helping.
Okay. Anybody else? What do you got?
You mean like saying you painting a cabinet? Is that
Yeah,
like, okay.
that's restoring. Is that hard?
Not really. It's not fun.
Is it harder to do that or go buy a new one?
Oh, I would say it's very easy. Because you gotta lift it and bring it home.
You can pull the-
Yeah.
Yeah.
There we go. That's why. If you could take an old object and restore it, what would you choose?
Are you gonna finish this sentence? It's in.
I know what Stephen would choose. What kind of car would you choose, Stephen? Oh. Well, my dream car is the next one, if you can bump the slide. Yeah.
Dream on.
Unfortunately, I don't fit in that, so it is no chance. So I did have an old car once that we kind of restored, but that got sold for college tuition. So, but we did together restore a house. So I think that's the next slide. There is a little 2-room farmhouse that we purchased. I purchased it about
2 months before
2 or
we got
3
married.
months before we got married, and it was okay, but it was perfect. When you restore something, you have to have a vision, right, of what it's going to look like in the end, and you have to have a vision that it's more than just 2 rooms, for example. Okay, and we'll show you that picture here after a bit, what it turned out like. So it turned out really nice. But what we really fell in love with here is this house is out in the country, but yet it's 5 minutes from town. It's 13 and a half minutes to my office from this house. When I get in the car now, in my truck in the morning, you know how your iPhone tells you how long it's going to take you to get to work? And it says 13 minutes to work. Traffic is light. And I'm like, oh, there's only like 2 stop signs between here and my work. So, but yeah, I fell in love with this house, and Jody had to fall in love with it.
No, I did too.
And, but this house has really been something else for us as far as, and Jody will tell you more here in a minute, but it's kind of been a safe haven, not just for Jody and I, but for our kids and for family members who, hey, they needed a place and so forth. And she talked about downsizing. We talked about downsizing. And then we're like, oh, I don't know if we want to leave here. So anyway, all right, it's all yours.
Okay. So like Greg kind of opened up with, our whole focus this evening will be about the restoration of human beings and being human. And several weeks ago, we actually started a series, whether you knew it or not, titled "I'm Only Human." And so that first week, we talked about how we as humans are created in God's image, and that gives us, of course, privilege and honor, worth and purpose. And then the second week, we talked about the devastation of being human, and unfortunately, each one of us has that thread of DNA that is the sin gene woven through all of us that we inherited from our original parents, Adam and Eve. And because of that devastation of sin came consequences and brokenness, but we also drove home the fact that through a relationship with Jesus, he redeems us of our sin and brokenness. And now, tonight, we pick up really on that same theme in the third part of our series, the restoration of being human. And we have 3 points that we're kind of hone in on this evening. And just like restoring any project or any object, I would guess that most of us have had a paper or a project that we've started and it's going nowhere quickly, and at least not the direction we wanted it to go. And so we decided that the best option would be to just ditch it, right, and start over. And it's not a great feeling when you come to that conclusion that you just need to start over, because you know all the time and the energy and the sweat and blood and tears you've already poured into that project or that paper. And so it's heart-wrenching to think about starting over, and you wonder, will the end result really be worth it? And will the time and energy that you pour into it, into the redo, be worth it? Was the restoration of our home, basically starting over, only to have to live in a detached garage for 3 months with a 2-year-old, was that restoration going to be worth it? And so tonight in our lesson that centers around the classic Bible story of Noah's Ark and the Great Flood, we're going to continue to process the project that God had begun, the project of humanity. And he actually comes to a place here in the story of Noah and the ark where he actually grieved that he had made man and woman. His heart was filled with pain and grief because of the horrific sin state of humanity. And I just want to share a few verses out of Genesis chapter 6, beginning in verse 5. The Lord saw how great man's wickedness on the earth had become, and that every inclination of the thoughts of his heart was only evil all the time. The Lord was grieved that he had made man on the earth, and his heart was filled with pain. So the Lord said, I will wipe mankind whom I have created from the face of the earth, men and animals and creatures that move along the ground and birds of the air, for I am grieved that I even made them. But Noah had found favor in the eyes of the Lord. So God's judgment clearly revealed that need for restoration. This is not saying that God had regretted creating human beings, nor had he made a mistake. He was simply expressing the deep sorrow at the outrage of sin that had so permeated every generation and only spiraled rapidly out of control with every generation coming out. So God recognized the wickedness of humanity that disheartened him so deeply that he decided it was time to just start over. It was time for a redo. Time for a major renovation and restoration project, but it wasn't going to come without heartache for God nor for humanity. It broke his heart to see the wretched state of humanity. It broke his heart to take such drastic measures as to wipe out the entire universe. But God in his grace knew what humanity needed, and that was restoration. So this children's Bible story that we often think of the cute animals and the big boat, it can be hard to believe. Greg and I had a conversation about that the other evening, just struggling to really believe the facts that come out of that story and how all these animals fit in one big boat and how they just walked onto the boat and how Noah in human strength built this massive ark. It's all hard to believe and hard to comprehend, but we can know and we can trust that although the entire Bible is equally true, it's not equally clear. So a good thought to hang on. Although the entire Bible is equally true, it's not equally clear. So many things, events, stories in the Bible that are hard to understand or even believe from our human perspective, we can trust, again, that it's equally true because God says it's true, even though it may not be totally or equally clear. So God would continue to move his plan for salvation for all people forward in ways that will astound us, even through the story of Noah and the ark. This whole account of Noah's life illustrates a theme that weaves its way through the entire Bible. From Old Testament to New Testament, from Genesis to Revelation, the golden thread of God's heart and soul is to restore broken people. So as God in judgment against man and woman's wickedness prepared to bring a great universal flood that would wipe out every living creature and every plant found in the entire universe, it seems harsh, it seems radical and extreme from a human perspective. but yet this story actually elevates and highlights God's grace in magnificent ways. So as we pause and ask, why Noah? Why, of all the people on the earth, would God spare Noah and his family and not some other common family? Well, we're told right here in the scriptures that Noah had found favor in God's eyes. Noah was a righteous man, blameless among the people of his time, and he walked with God. So Noah walked with God. He had found the secret. He did not earn God's favor. Noah was still a sinful man, but indeed faithful in seeking God. Therefore, Noah and his family were spared God's judgment because God is gracious and rewards people who diligently seek him and walk with him. So God's grace is rising up out of this passage in ways that really just leave us enamored when we think about it, because God's grace to spare a remnant in Noah's family is clearly seen. God's grace to use Noah and his family to preserve the image of God on the earth through the coming judgment. God's grace to give the human race 120 years to repent while Noah was building the ark, speck by speck, detail by detail. 1,400,000 cubic feet, we're told, was the size of this boat, similar to 522 modern-day railroad cars. In the middle of the desert, without modern tools and electricity and power sources, and then to gather food to feed these animals for well over a year, and scholars at their best estimate 45,000 animals aboard Noah's Ark. So God's grace to equip and empower Noah to do all that he had commanded him to do. God's grace to give Noah conversations about God with his neighbors who stood in disbelief and probably mocked Noah for obeying God. God's grace demonstrated through Noah's Ark to be a place of refuge and restoration, a place of salvation for Noah and his family and these animals. And so God's grace all over the place. God judges sin, but God's grace opens the way for every human being to be saved from the dreadful judgment of sin. So God's judgment would reveal a need for restoration. And then our second point, God's covenant or promise will reveal God's plan for restoration, because God always has a plan in motion, and as one side of God's plan reveals judgment to the entire earth, the other side of his plan was to preserve humanity that he has made in his image. Genesis 7 goes on to tell us that Noah did all that God commanded him to do, and the animals, the food, and Noah and his family boarded the ark. And just like that, the door of the ark was shut behind Noah, and for 7 days, it didn't rain a single drop. And Noah waited, and he waited, and he waited. But 7 days later, the floodgates opened, and it was torrential downpour for 40 days and 40 nights. And just as God had promised, the inhabitants of this earth were wiped out. And just as promised, Noah and his family and the animals were spared from God's judgment. So can you imagine the mix of grief and gratitude Noah and his family experienced, knowing they were spared while their neighbors and their loved ones experienced death? Yet 1 year later, the floodwaters receded, just as God had promised. And as an expression of his gratitude, Noah immediately exited the ark and made a sacrifice to God as a worshipful response to the God who had spared his life. You see, the flood reminds us that God has prepared a way of escape for those who trust in his son, Jesus, which leads us to our third point. God's promise reveals the hope for restoration. And so as Noah made a sacrifice, God made a promise that he would never destroy the world again by such a catastrophic flood as this. This promise was punctuated by a universal sign in the sky, a rainbow that we still marvel at. Every time we see a rainbow, don't we ooh and ah and reflect on the symbolism that reminds us of God's promise to his people. And then comes another step of restoration in Genesis chapter 9. God commanded Noah and his sons to be fruitful and increase in number and fill the earth. So God promising to restore what was lost by repopulating the earth. So how does this demonstration of God's judgment, along with the story of Noah in the ark, impact you and I today? Well, first of all, God's judgment is as real today as it was in Noah's day. And we know even though the promises of God are just as real and bright for each one of you, we also know we're living in a dark and evil time. Yet we also know that God's grace is being demonstrated through his patience in so many ways in our world today. And so the picture of God's redeeming grace to save Noah and his family by means of the ark actually was a foreshadowing of the redemption Jesus Christ offers you and me today. The ark points to the redeeming, restoring, regenerating work of salvation that Jesus offers that saves us from coming judgment. And just as there was only one door into the ark, there is only one way to a relationship with Jesus. By faith, we confess him as Lord of our lives, and by God's saving grace, we escape God's judgment for our sin. So the ark is a reality of God's judgment for the people of Noah's day and the promise of restoration for Noah's family. But today, the cross of Jesus, which some call cruel and offensive, is the gracious reality for every human being living on this earth that God's judgment is real and impending, but the cross of Jesus is the most radical expression and demonstration of God's love to a world in need of a redo. It's the only hope we have for restoration and salvation because God promises us that there is no sin beyond what the grace of God through Jesus can forgive. There's no depth of depression, discouragement, or defeat that is beyond restoration. There's no addiction that God's redeeming grace can't break and demolish. No broken relationship, broken dreams, broken commitments, broken promises, broken heart, minds, and or even emotions that God can't restore. And so we do have a picture of our restored home. There it is. And it's actually a home that has become a house of faith. It's been a safe haven for our children, a house that has weathered many literal and physical and emotional storms, a house that has stood the test of time because the original foundation is well over 100 years old. A home that, like Greg said, has been a sanctuary to many. When Greg's sister had a horrific automobile accident 4 years ago, as a single one, she came to live with us for 8 months, and we restored her back to health, to where she's out living on her own now. And then when Greg's dad had a crisis last fall, he came to stay with us for several weeks. And a good friend of mine pegged it best that our home has actually become a sanctuary for healing and for hope. And so we take that very humbly and as an honor that God allowed us to restore this home in a way that brings him glory. So you and I have hope today for a way of escape because God in his love recognized that we, you and I, needed restoration in a way only he could offer. And he made a plan and a promise that included his son, Jesus. And so the door is open. He desperately wants us to enter by faith through the amazing grace of God. So a very powerful story found in the early pages of the Bible that often some don't take literally or seriously and see it as a children's Bible story, but such a powerful story that really points to the redeeming, restoring work of Jesus Christ on the cross. So we have, well, we thought there'd be a lot more people here tonight. So we had really planned on a question for each table. So if your table wants to pick a couple of these questions and just hash them out and discuss them, because again, this is where we grow in our faith, where we practice a safe place to be able to share just our thoughts, and it's okay to agree to disagree, and to just be able to just encourage one another in your growth. And so just if you guys want to take a couple minutes to pick a couple questions just to hash them out, and then we can kind of have open mic and hear what you guys came up with. So pick a couple, and it doesn't really even matter if you pick the same ones. So just whatever looks interesting to you to discuss.